Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar titled Voices in Children's and Teen Literature, What's Socioeconomics Got to Do with It? Presented by Dr. Christina Dorr. My name is Rachel Fisher, and I am the Member Services Librarian for Technical Services at Cooperative Computer Services, or CCS. Today's webinar has been sponsored by CCS and Rails. Rails has awarded CCS the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Training Grant for a webinar series on collection development strategies to support diversity initiatives. I would like to thank Rails for helping to make this webinar possible today. I will now introduce today's speaker, Dr. Christina Dorr, who is joining us from Ohio. She is an award-winning librarian, faculty member of OSU and Kent State University, author, presenter, and consultant. She has served on a number of state and national book award committees, including the Caldecott, Coretta Scott King, Geisel Award, and Stonewall committees. Her third book, Profiles of Resilience, books for children and teens that center the lived experience of generational poverty, has just been published by ALA Publishing. Feel free to type any questions that you have into the chat. And today we will be having an interactive portion in which we'll be separating the group into breakout rooms. And so we will be assigning you rooms 2 times during the webinar today. Christina?
Good morning, and thank you, Rachel, so much. Thank you to CCS and to Rails for sponsoring this today. And I am so glad all of you are here, chose to spend your time for the next hour and a half talking a little bit about children and teens in generational poverty. We're going to talk a little bit about literature about them and for them. And we're going to take a look at a few tools that can help with collection development in this area and other areas as well. My name is Christina Dorr. My pronouns are she, her. As Rachel said, I'm coming to you from Central Ohio. I'm presenting and live on the native land of the Kaskaskia tribes. You will see my website and my email there. They will show up at the end as well. I am going to take you to the website a little later to show you some resources there. And please do feel free to email me with any questions or follow-up comments when we're finished. As you'll find out, I like to talk. I can talk the entire time, but I'd rather this be a conversation. So if you do have questions or comments, explanations, ideas, whatever it is, please do, as Rachel said, pop it in the chat box or raise your hand and you can unmute and we can chat as we go along. Just a little bit more about me. I've had a career in libraries for over 30 years. I started out as a public librarian and as a college librarian. And then I spent the bulk of my years in school libraries. So I have had the good fortune of having either taught or provide library services for preschool through grad school. My PhD is from the Ohio State University in Children's and Teen Literature. And I am an adjunct faculty member for Kent State and Ohio State. And I'm an author, speaker, and consultant. This is me with my husband of 43 years. I can't believe it's been that long. Our 2 daughters and their guys. This is our family. Question for you to think about, and think about with a group for just a few minutes. How were you rich as a child? And I'm talking outside of socioeconomics as well. And how did this richness afford you privileges? Also, how were you poor as a child? And how did this disempower you? Rachel's going to pop you into a chat room or breakout rooms, excuse me. We're just going to have a couple minutes to talk with each other on your ideas.
I'm going to assign you to 4 breakout rooms.
Welcome back. I was popped into breakout room number 1, so I listened for a little bit, and there was some great discussion going on. Would anyone like to share whole group either one way that you were rich as a child or one way that you were poor?
I think we all talked about that we had access to libraries as a child, either a public library or a bookmobile, and that was such a great experience.
Excellent. Anyone else wish to share? I was rich as a child with books as well, but not quite in the same way. We had very few books in our home and a little tiny library in town that we occasionally got to. And all of our books were communal in our house. No one got to own any of them in particular. But my mother, I was number 8 out of 9 children. So as you would guess, my mom had very little time to read on her own. But she did read or tell us stories every single night, since she found stories fascinating. Another way I was rich is we had all the food we wanted, which is huge for a child growing up in generational poverty. Many of our kids that walk through our doors know hunger every single day. And we had the food we needed because we lived on a farm and we raised or grew, and my mother was a fabulous cook, and so I was never hungry. The other way I was rich was I was white. I'm white, and that gives me a level of privilege that others who are not don't have. Anybody want to share ways you were rich as a child? Poor as a child. For me, poverty looked like having enough food, but not having enough of anything else. Another way I was poor was I was a girl, growing up at a time and a place where girls mattered little, and girls were given a very small view of who they could be and what they could do in life. I also was raised in a very, very strict Christian religion background, which is not to denigrate that for anyone, but in my experience, it was about shame, fear, and guilt. And that restricted my world as well. All of these were ways that disempowered me. Here's a picture of what poverty looks like. That's little first grade me. The year I learned to read and fell in love with Miss Evans, my first grade teacher. Now, if you look at me there and you look at kids that walk through your door, I don't look poor. It was picture day. This is an outfit my mother made. She made sure my hair was clean and curled because picture day is an important day in a child's life. You think about the kids that walk through your door. Some of them have sneakers that are more expensive than what you provide your children, possibly. Or they have a new iPhone that's newer than your model. And this is the message I'd like to send, to think about with something like this, is that to live in generational poverty is a level of constant shame. It's a level of knowing that you're different, knowing that you don't have what others have, knowing that you don't have the opportunities in life that others have. And so when parents can provide what looks good on a child to help them feel like they fit in and not feel that level of shame, they do. And this is very important for us to acknowledge and not judge on the parts of the children or their parents. Dr. Ruby Payne is a researcher that we're going to take a look at three researchers or three voices. And Dr. Ruby Payne is one that has been cited continuously over a few decades for her work on poverty. And her work has some value, but it is not the be all and end all of taking a look at who children in generational poverty are and what we can assume about them or expect from them. Here's some of the shortcomings in her research. She was not raised in generational poverty herself. So what this does is, say you've been diagnosed with cancer. You go to the very best oncologist. This person knows anatomy and physiology, knows how cancer spreads through the body, knows treatments, knows timelines, knows effects, knows what your probable outcome can be. But this doctor has never had cancer themselves. So they have no idea what it feels like. Another shortcoming with Dr. Payne's work is that she doesn't address institutional racism or any of the other institutional frameworks in this country that hold the majority of the people, but not the people that are in power in this country, that hold them in poverty. And she doesn't deal with the intersectionality of identities. So she deals with people that live in generational poverty as if they were one-dimensional, that poverty was all there was that affects their life. She talks a little bit about urban versus rural poverty, and there are some differences, and there are some similarities as well. I have to say that when I share my story of poverty, it is only my story and no one else's. I don't make assumptions that anyone else's story is the same as mine, although there may be similarities. I was raised obviously in rural poverty, and urban poverty is, with some similarities, a different story. She also talks about generational and situational poverty. And here's the difference. And COVID has made this difference less important. Situational poverty happens when someone in the middle class who has the supports, probably the education, probably the connections, and has been living a middle class life, something happens that sinks them in poverty temporarily. So it could be a death, it could be a move, it could be illness, it could be situations having to take care of an elderly parent. There's a lot of things that can happen that will put a family into situational poverty. From there, it takes some time, but usually those supports, the education, the networking that they have will get them out of the poverty and back into middle class. It's changed with COVID. It's become more difficult. But generational poverty is defined as at least 2 generations back where your family has operated in poverty. And the longer the number of generations go, the number of years that this goes, the more difficult it becomes to escape poverty. A few characteristics of generational poverty, according to Dr. Payne, and she has several characteristics. These 5, though, are probably the most pertinent to our talk today. And one is that families that live in generational poverty have a survival orientation. What is important is today, possibly this week, maybe this month, but beyond that, there is very little thought of the future. Why? Because there may be no future. What we need to take care of is today. So therefore, the second one, time only occurs in the present. This is where we are. This is what we're doing. This is what matters right now. Therefore, things like going to school, getting homework done, thinking about college, planning for the future has very little place in many families of generational poverty. There's often a belief in fate or destiny. So this is what we were born into. This is what we were handed, the cards we were dealt, and there's very little we can do to change it other than to survive day to day. My mother's way of saying it was bloom where you're planted, with the idea of we had no control over where we were planted or what situations we were handed. The importance of relationships cannot be overstated. In families of generational poverty, there are very few possessions. There's very little thought of the future. So who you know and the relationships you have with them are all important. This plays out in ways of, if I don't have enough money for rent and I'm going to be kicked out into the street on the 31st of the month, I can call you and you will come and you'll take me in, because when it happens to you, I will do the same for you. You know, you think about middle class people, if we are stuck somewhere and need a ride, we pull up the Uber app on our phone. If we are short one month and need something, we have credit cards. We have material ways of taking care of what we need. Mostly people in generational poverty have each other. And this last one, ownership of people, goes along with that. I was one of 9 little possessions of my mother, because who we were was all important to her, and we were what she had in life. So these all work together to give children growing up in these families a picture that doesn't always jive with what they're hearing at school, doesn't jive with the rest of society, doesn't jive with middle class thoughts and aspirations. There is another researcher, Rhee. I'm going to pull up a video of hers. I want you to listen to what she says about the American dream and where people of generational poverty fall.
The statistics that I think is most interesting is that if you look at the top quartile of American kids by income in America, so the richest quarter of kids, and you compare them internationally to the richest quarter of kids in every other country, our children rank 23rd out of 30 developed nations. The poorest fourth of our kids, compared to the poorest fourth of other nations, kids, also rank third. So we have not just a problem with our poor kids, we have a problem with our not poor kids too. And the reality is that while our rich kids in this country may be doing better than the poor kids in this country, they're not doing better against their peers in other nations. And that's who they're going to be competing against for jobs when they grow up, not with the kids down the street. So that's one thing. The second thing I'd say is, does poverty matter? Absolutely. When you are a child who lives in abject poverty and you are coming to school every day without being fed a healthy breakfast, without being put to bed the night before at a decent hour, maybe the electricity in your house got shut off, you have a cavity in your tooth the size of a penny. I mean, these things matter. It makes it harder for kids to come to school and learn every day. It makes it harder for the teachers to teach. There's no question about that. However, what the disturbing trend is right now is that now people are saying, well, because of poverty, kids can't. So when kids come from poverty, we can't possibly expect the schools and the teachers to do anything about it because look at their parents and look at the environment they come from. And I would say that contention is absolutely wrong. Because if you look at any circumstance across civilization in any country, what we know is that the best tool that we have to fight intergenerational poverty and break that cycle of poverty is education. It's not a particular social program or this or that. It is making sure that that kid gets a high quality education. So for poor kids in this country, we should not be saying, oh, because you're poor, we can't be expected to provide you with a high quality education. Instead, what we should be saying is because you're poor, it is more incumbent upon us to make sure that you get a high quality education because that's going to ensure that you're not poor going forward. And I think that this notion, I mean, so if you look at social mobility rates in this country, they are actually near the bottom internationally, which means that if you are a child born into poverty in this country, the likelihood that you will ever escape poverty is not good. That to me goes against every ideal we have as a country. That is so un-American, right? This is the country where it doesn't matter where you were born, what your color your skin is, that if you work hard and you do the right thing, you can live the American dream. But that's not the reality for most of the kids in this country today, because if you grow up in this country today in poverty, the likelihood is very great that you go to a failing school where you're not going to learn the skills and knowledge that you need to be a productive member of society. That means that the whole premise on which this country is founded is broken. And in my opinion, the best bet that we have to fix it is through education.
Let's think a minute about what she's talking about. Although her arguments have some validity, some of the weaknesses in it. She is from an immigrant family, but she was not raised in generational poverty herself. Think about what she's talking about, the American dream. Who created the American dream? And on what values were they created? And on what resources and possibility? What she's really talking about is an assimilation mindset, not valuing these children and families for their joys, their riches, their contributions, their gifts, and understanding their challenges as well. But she's talking about assimilating these children and family into what a middle class idea of who they should be. So what does this do to a child when you expect them to be who they're not? It says you're not good enough as you are. The only way you're going to be good enough is you need to be like us or like me. Her point about education is, yes, education is an important answer, but education based on whose values and for what needs and to what end. And education will not ensure that you are successful. It depends on a whole lot of other factors. It's not nearly as simple as this. let's explore a little bit further. Teva Zanicki has a short video that I'm going to play called "We Can End Poverty, but Why Haven't We?"
You booked a cozy Verbo mountain cabin with a kitchen where
Apologies.
14 years ago, I became the executive director of a small shelter called Growing Home. With the help of just one other full-time staffer and hundreds of caring volunteers, we provided about 30 families a year with warm beds, home-cooked meals, and a lot of care. We had few resources, but a lot of heart. One day I was walking down the hall of our shelter and a young woman with a baby and a toddler approached and greeted me. "Teva!" I did the, "Hey, how are
Pardon me?
you?" that I do when I don't actually recognize someone who clearly knows me. "I'm Jackie," she said. "Do you remember me? I was in the shelter with my mom when I was a kid." At this point, I did remember her. She was a smart, energetic teen, a freshman in high school just 6 years before, full of hope for her future. Now, she was a mom herself. She dropped out of high school her senior year and was working in the local box store. "I remembered your shelter was such a safe, warm place to stay," she said. "So I thought of you when my kids and I lost our home." I was horrified. I never thought our shelter would become a rite of passage for parents in our community. Jackie was the face of intergenerational poverty, but she wasn't supposed to be. We aimed to help families achieve self-sufficiency, not just provide a temporary place to stay during a tough time. We'd helped Jackie's family once. She was supposed to grow up, finish school, get a good job, and live a happy, stable life. She didn't make it. And that's when I realized we were getting it all wrong. And this should worry us, because the stresses of growing up in poverty permanently alter the wiring in the brains of developing children, lowering their resilience and increasing their chances for a number of serious physical and emotional problems. Studies tell us that kids in poverty fall behind early, and that by the time they're 4 years old, they're already a year and a half behind their middle-class peers. And when they aren't reading proficiently by 3rd grade, they're 6 times less likely to finish high school. It's almost impossible for them to catch up. Now, think of Jackie again, and multiply Jackie by 16 million. Because right now, we're failing the 16 million children living in poverty in the US today, including 190,000 kids right here in Colorado. That's enough kids to fill Mile High Stadium 2.5 times. What I realized that day is that Jackie isn't the failure, we are. We spend over $1 trillion each year on poverty in this country and have one of the most robust nonprofit sectors in the world. And yet our poverty rate is far higher than most of the developed world and is more than double that of our biggest global competitor, China. I believe there are 3 main ways we're getting things wrong. First, we've relegated poverty work to the realm of the heart, to the Mother Teresas, to the do-gooders, to the charities and the churches. And heart is absolutely essential, but my beef with leaving poverty there is that it's dismissive of the seriousness and the complexity of the problem we are trying to address. No matter how many cans of soup or warm beds we provide, we will not solve poverty without our brains as well. Too often we focus on the immediate human needs without addressing the issues that create them. It would be like responding to the diabetes epidemic by setting up more clinics for the blind. Next, We need to stop placing the burden of escaping poverty on the individuals experiencing it and start breaking down the crushing systems that keep people there. Like when we try to help people escape poverty by achieving self-sufficiency, when in fact what we have is a structural problem. There are far too many jobs in our economy that just don't pay a living wage. Presumably, we need all these jobs. So let's think of a way to structure it so that parents who are working full-time or more earn enough to support their families. I'll never forget the mom who came into our shelter after giving birth to triplets. Her 2-week-old preemies were still in intensive care, and she was already back at work at the fast food restaurant. Because she wasn't paid a minimum wage, a living wage rather, and because she didn't get paid for that month she'd spent in the hospital, she'd lost her home. And now she was working overtime to try to get a place to bring home her children. Each night after work, she spent 2 hours on the bus to go and visit her babies in intensive care. One day she was crying because the nurse had chided her for not spending enough time with them. And these two flaws in our methodology stem from a flaw in our belief. This kind of poverty will not always be with us. It is not the norm throughout the developed world. We can end it. So that day when Jackie came back, I went back to the drawing board and I began to think about what we could do to actually solve poverty. We're just one nonprofit in one small corner of the country, but I pledged that day to do better and to work with our families to identify and overcome the impossible barriers that they're up against. The emerging thinking is that the ecosystem in which kids grow up matters. New study from Harvard, in fact, shows a causal relationship between the county you live in as a kid and your future earnings as an adult. They've even been able to monetize a positive or a negative effect for each year you live in a given county as a child. Since we can't just take all the kids in our poor community and move them to more affluent counties, our goal is to impact the place in which they live. We aim to reach at least 60%.
I am going to stop it right there, but I am going to encourage you to take a look at the rest of this video. It is powerful, and she has several ideas that truly talk about working with families and understanding who they are and asking them what the needs are. But one thing that we can truly take from this video that'll help us today, tomorrow, when we are working in our workplaces, is that this is about respect and basic human rights for every person that walks through your door, regardless of what way they're diverse and how they are struggling, that we need to look at them and see human beings and their needs. So according to Ruby, and we're going back to Ruby for a minute, what does she say that what children and teens need to escape generational poverty? She says, a situation that's so painful that anything would be better. And that is true. If a child is living in poverty and it is a situation that's not bearable to them, they will seek otherwise when they have the power to be able to do that. So I remember the day when I was 12 years old, standing in my bedroom that I shared with my sister in a little trailer room and thinking that I'm not going the path that the rest of my family had. Every one of them had dropped out of school. Every one of them worked on the family farm. Every one of them worked hard every single day and were getting nowhere. So I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I was going to be different, I decided. Another one is a specific talent or ability that provides an opportunity for them. For me, I was a perfect fit with school. I was an academic. I loved it. I'd rather be at school than at home. My teachers were my heroes. So that was my talent. a goal or vision for something they wanted to be or have. I didn't know exactly what that was, but I was ready to put it on the line and try. And this last one, someone who sponsors them. And I put that in quotation marks for a reason. Ruby says an educator or spouse or mentor or role model who shows them a different way or convinces them that they could live differently. My problem with this one is that it smacks of saviorism, and it also smacks of white saviorism. Now, this doesn't mean that they don't need people in their life, that they don't need supports. They absolutely do. It depends, though, on how those people go at lending their support and understanding them. So for me, I had an aunt who would come visit on occasion and talk just to me and ask me what I was doing and encourage me in school, something that was denigrated at home. My teachers were my heroes, but anyone who had an education in my home was denigrated. That was the ideas around people who were professionals, that they think they're better than we are as a family. I met my husband when I was 16, and he became a role model for me. So it is important. It depends on, though, how it's done. There's two things, though, that Ruby doesn't understand or acknowledge. And one is the system-wide power structures that hold you in place are nearly impossible to overcome, whether they're race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, age, geography, ability, primary language, on and on and on. If you're not part of the group in this country that holds the power, then you are part of a system that holds you out of power. And the other thing she doesn't understand is that sometimes it takes the ability and willingness to turn your back on everyone and everything you know and walk away in order to get what it is you require. So let me give you an example of this one. I was talking to a faculty at a school district not far from where I live. And one of the high school teachers that was the football coach said to me, I don't understand this. We had this one boy, full ride scholarship to college, all 4 years. He had a tutor, he had a place to live, he had books, he had tuition, everything ready for him. He lasted one semester. He came home for Christmas break, got back in with his old group of buddies. They got in trouble, and he's now in jail. How did that happen? And that's because of number two. Now, if you think about who you are right now in your situation, if there was something you really wanted to do, really wanted to have, somebody that you really wanted to be, and it required leaving everyone and everything you know, could you do it? Most kids can't do it either. So what can we as library professionals do for our marginalized youth? This is our children in generational poverty, but it is all marginalized youth. Number one, be present and respectful. That's what this is about. Basic human rights and respect for every child that walks through your door. You may not like their behavior all the time, but know that when they come in and they act in ways that get attention, they're just saying, I'm here. See me. Another thing is honor their story, skills, and knowledge. They have a lot more than we may recognize, and their skills and knowledge are not necessarily with the middle class values. And but they have survival skills that middle class people will probably never know. Keep in mind their trials and challenges because they have many every single day. Reach out to families and ask what they need. Don't assume what they need. Another example, I was a school librarian in an elementary school a few years ago that the story was circulating. It had happened before I was there. That there was a family who had just had their 6th child. The 3 older ones were in that school. One of the teachers of one of those children found out that they didn't have a refrigerator at home. The staff pooled money, bought them a refrigerator, and had it delivered to their home, their apartment. The family accepted it, said thank you very much, promptly sold it, and went to Florida to visit extended family who hadn't even seen the 3 youngest children. Now, some middle-class minds could not believe they were so irresponsible. But think about it. If you don't have enough food week to week, day to day, why do you need a refrigerator? Second of all, if there is a real risk of being turned out onto the street on the 30th of the month, you can't take a refrigerator with you. And third of all, what is important? Important is contact to family, because family and relationships are really what they have. What else can we do? We can ask children and teens, what do they really want in life? Not what do you think you deserve, or not what you think they deserve, and often not what they think they deserve, what it is they truly want. I've heard people say, that kid needs to go to college. She's got the brains to be a lawyer. She can do. But what is it she really wants to do? Maybe she wants to be the best nail artist in the community. What is it she really wants? Encourage them in their desires. Provide opportunities for their choices. Help them realize that these opportunities that you might help get for them may only come their way once. And if they don't take advantage of it now, they may not have those opportunities again. Don't impose your values and wishes on them. Show hope and help them understand that there is no one more important than themselves, and their needs come first. And that is very much subsumed in families of generational poverty. My mother's line up to her dying day was, family takes care of family. And that's all there is to it. Your needs are subsumed for the collective whole. And finally, provide excellent literature that reflects and inspire. And that's what we're going to hop to in just one second here. We're going to talk about books of authors and illustrators that get this right for children, depicting children in generational poverty. And then we're going to take a look at some people that are inspirations, okay? But I'm going to ask Rachel to pop you into the chat room for just a very brief time. Is there anything more in this list that I should have added for supporting marginalized youth? I would love to know. So Rachel, if you can pop us into there just for a brief time to talk.
I've opened up all of the breakout rooms. Please join your breakout room when we prompt. Okay, everyone's back.
Is there anything anyone would like to share? I'm hoping this has all given you quite a bit of food for thought. Feel free to pop things in the chat or to ask questions at the end or email me at another point. I'd love to know your ideas. So what is the purpose of stories? I'm just going to give you 3 resources to take a look at it at another time. Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop is professor emeritus at Ohio State. Back in the 80s, she was one of the first to change the conversation about who should be included in stories and who is being left out. So she has a video, she has a paper titled Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. That is a must to take a look at. Recently, in a Hornbook article, was a year or so ago, Uma Krishnaswamy, an author and a researcher, wrote an article called Why Stop at Windows and Mirrors? Children's Book Prisms. Uma argues that we need to take the mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors one step further and show that books need to truly represent the whole of a child, not look at one part, one-dimensional characters. And the final one is another TED Talk by Bryn Welch explaining why it is so critical that every child see themselves in a book and many books, and that it's so critical that all children see others in books as well. So here's just a few authors and illustrators that get the story of children in generational poverty correct. Cynthia Ryland, who has written for very young children all the way up to teens, grew up in Appalachia in West Virginia, and she will say in her autobiographies that she values the richness of her childhood, but she couldn't stay there. She had to leave it in order to become the writer, to be able to share her stories. She'll go back to visit, but she must leave it behind. Her stories are beautiful. Matt De La Pena, he lived not only in abject poverty, but he also straddled 2 worlds. His mother was white, his father was Mexican, and he never felt like he fit anywhere. His books span from young children's level all the way up to teens as well. Christian Robinson, a brilliant illustrator of picture books. He was raised by his Nana because his mother was an addict. And it's his Nana in Last Stop on Market Street that is the woman that he credits with not only giving him everything he needed to live, but everything he needed to grow and become an artist. Angela Johnson, books for our young children all the way up to teens, talking about life as an African American. In some of hers are city-based, some of them are country-based for settings, but the poverty that goes into it and what the joys in life are, as well as the challenges. Elizabeth Acevedo writes teen and adult books, but she is a powerful new voice just in the last few years for Latinx girls in particular, those that are growing up in poverty, those that are marginalized for the color of their skin, the language that they speak, their aspirations as a Latinx girl. Patricia Polacco, a Michigan author and illustrator, picture books that range from very young into middle grades. And her stories are historical fiction of her time period, her childhood split between her mother's and father's families as they were divorced, and what the joy of family is when you're growing up in poverty and how that created who she is. Jay Coles has written a couple of books. Tyler Johnson Was Here and Things We Couldn't Say, and has contributed to Black Enough. All teen books, very much teen. He grew up outside of Indianapolis, and when he was in 4th grade, he joined a gang. And he was the lookout boy for this gang because it meant he belonged somewhere. He had a scare. The gang came and tried to knock down his apartment when he was in 4th grade and home taking care of his 2 younger sisters. And what that did to him and prompted the family to leave the area is a very powerful story. Gary Paulson, who just passed away, has books for early chapter book readers, 2nd, 3rd grade, all the way up to adults. And his story, he was born to parents who were violent alcoholics. And there was no safety, no food, no heat, no clothing in his house. He credits several people having saved his life. But the first person he credits is the public librarian who took him in, gave him clothing, warmth, a place to sleep, food to eat, fed him books and writing materials. And he said she changed and saved his life. Jason Reynolds, who books span from his newest one, Stunt Boy, is 2nd or 3rd grade book, all the way up to teens. Next year he has a picture book and an adult book coming out, so it will be an even wider span. He writes powerfully of inner city African American children and what the joys and challenges are. Just a quick side note, the gentleman on the right here beside Jason is Matthew Carter, who is the real life ghost in the track series. And Matthew is online on MatthewCarterTalks.com, and he is an inspirational speaker and simply magnificent in telling his story. What kinds of books can show children in poverty other worlds and lives? I was a voracious reader of biography, autobiography, and memoir because I had to see lives that were different from mine and how they succeeded. Just a quote from Jason, you can't be it if you can't see it. This is opportunities for children to see something different. Sonia Sotomayor was Latinx, is Latinx. She grew up in a very poor family, oldest child. She was also very brittle diabetic, many challenges that she overcame. Maya Angelou in this picture book is the story, very honest story of her told at a level that would be good for upper elementary children about what her life was, what the issues were with it, and how she succeeded to become the writer and speaker that she was. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, this is an autobiography. What a story of this young man, Black, inner city, Jewish, and how the gifts of the area gave him what he needed as a child, but then he realized what he truly needed and who he needed to become and how he made those changes in his life. Homer Hickam Jr., if you know the movie October Sky, he has written several books, including Rocket Boys, that October Sky is based on. Very poor coal mining town in West Virginia, and how it was simply assumed that if you graduated from high school, your life was still going to be in the mines, and how he railed against that, how he went against his family and his town to become the engineer and the rocket scientist that he was. Coretta Scott, what a beautiful picture book illustrated by Kadir Nelson. You can see Kadir's work right here. He's the only illustrator that I know that can tell an entire story in one illustration. This centers around her before she was Coretta Scott King and the joys and challenges of her childhood. Malcolm Little, Malcolm X, Malcolm Little when he was a child. Both of these books were written by Ilyasa Shabazz, one of his younger daughters. The second one was co-written by Kekla Magoon, a fabulous voice in middle grade and teen literature. What a story that is, and the path and the changes that took place in his life to become who he was and accomplish what he did. Serena and Venus Williams, this book by Jeanette Winter, and there's several about the sisters, what it took, what their parents sacrificed in order to give them the experience and the training that they needed to become the grand athletes that they are. Mickey Mantle, story of a young man by Jonah Winter and C.F. Payne, and what Mickey's background was, what he had to overcome to do what he loved in life and make a difference in the sport of baseball. Pete Seeger was another one. Not only was he born in generational poverty, but he was born into a time of social change, and his voice went with him throughout his adult years, teen years and into adult years, to make a difference at that time period with his music. Barack Obama. I had someone question as to whether Barack should be considered a child that grew up in generational poverty. But when you look at his family, particularly on his mother's side, he absolutely was. And the varied experiences of his life and the times that he was moved and changed and had different caregivers played into this. Someone had said to me, is he poor enough? Was he poor enough to have his story told? And I said, any child who experiences poverty is poor enough to have their story told. Would you say to someone, are you Black enough to have your story told? Are you LGBTQ enough to have your story told? We all deserve to have our story told in the many ways that we are diverse. Jimi Hendrix, another one, brilliant guitarist, grew up in abject poverty, and story of how he turned that into the dream life that he had that ended too soon. John Lewis, when he died, what a legend, died with him. But he was a young man preaching to the chickens that knew what he wanted in life and what it was going to take to get there. Jose Hernandez, one of the few Latinx astronauts. His story is fascinating. It's an autobiography. Wilma Mankiller, the only female chief of the Cherokee Nation, who she came from, where she came from, how her life is so intricately tied with who her ancestry is and the difference she made, even though she was very much discriminated against as a woman. Carlos Santana, from taking his music to the streets to try to earn some money, to the differences he makes in the world today, is a fascinating story. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she was a child born in poverty, Jewish family, and she had very little handed to her, but the grit that she learned as a child served her well as an adult. Poetry can also be another type of literature that very much speaks to the heart of children in generational poverty. There are many additional resources here. I can share this PowerPoint with Rachel, and she can share it with those that would like to have the resources that are in it. But there are many other places that you can look about children in poverty, books for children in poverty, books about children in poverty. Just a wealth of stories and resources. So now I want to shift to collection development tools, a diversity audit. I've worked with this with several library districts and school districts. And I'm going to point out 3 of them today quickly. Each of them are incomplete. None of them are a complete tool for analyzing a collection to make sure you have a wide variety of viewpoints, experiences, and representation. But each of them are a step forward to taking a look at our collection and making sure it's starting to serve those who walk through our door. So how do you do this? You decide if you want to audit a whole collection or a sample. You research your community as to who's there. You decide on the tool that would be best to use. After you have audited the collection, you work the process to determine what the gaps are. Purchase quality new materials to fill the gap, and then you repeat. One tool is the Diverse Book Finder Collection Development Tool. Wanted to tell you this one is for picture books only. However, the other 3 tools are for a complete collection. The ways we look at identities that need representation, these are several. I'm sure there's more that I'm not thinking of at the moment that should be in this list, but we need to think widely. And as I said, none of these tools are complete in looking at all of these ways the identities need to be represented. Tidal Wave Diversity Collection Development Tool is one that will let you download your entire collection to Tidal Wave. It will sort out by topic. It'll give you the average age of your books, how many books in fiction, nonfiction, and the total number of items that hit that particular type of identity. It can break it down farther by Dewey if you're interested. And it can also give you a printout of the list of those books. Teachingbooks.net is a paid service of a lot of resources for books, using them with children and teens. And one of their pieces is their collection development tool. It is organized by genre. It does hit many cultural and curricular areas, gives you both quantitative and qualitative measures, and gives you the recency of your publications. So this is one portion of a library that has been, these are the overall results from a teachingbooks.net audit. It has African American, Native American, Asian American, disability, LGBTQ, immigrant, Latinx, and multiracial. So each one is limited in their own way. None of them, as you can tell so far, take in socioeconomics. There is something called the Culturally Responsive Curriculum Scorecard through New York University, another tool that can help you understand your collection. These are the areas, though, that it takes in. And there are several other additional resources that can inform a collection audit. Before I go to a couple resources and Q&A at the end, I wanted to share with you what Matt De La Pena said to me at one point. I interviewed him for my latest book, Profiles in Resilience. And he ended the interview with this quote: "Every child who stands before you has an epic story that precedes the encounter. They have absorbed a lifetime of messaging from their parents or caregivers, from their community, from the streets, and they are in the process of squaring this local messaging with the more national messaging they are getting from TV and movies and social media and from our educational system. This process is difficult and sometimes overwhelming, especially when you're growing up in poverty. I believe the best thing we can do for a child is to love them without conditions. There is power to simply beginning every interaction from a place of love." Here's my website, my email. I do present seminars for the Bureau of Education and Research, best award-winning books for children, as well as best new books for children. I do teach for Kent State University, and one of the classes I teach is on gender and sexual identity in children's literature. I wanted to leave time for, we have 10 minutes. I'm going to take you to my website quickly just to show you some resources. And then please, any questions I can answer for you or point you in the right direction. And it is being a pain. There it is.
We still see the presentation.
There are several items on here you can take a look at. Oh, thank you. Is that better?
No, I think you need to unshare the screen and then change it to the web page.
Better?
Yes.
Okay. There are several resources up here. There is a link here that has more websites you could possibly ever want and other resources for finding books that are authentic voices for children and young adults. That would help you. I do have some author illustrator interviews here that could be of help. I need to do better on that one and add more. My BER classes you can take a look at here. I do consult and I am a speaker, so if I could be of any use to your organization, please let me know. I run a writer's retreat every year. If you're a writer and you're interested, let me know. But this is my newest book, and it does give far more than I was able to present in this time.
We do have a question in the chat. Christine Edison asks, my library is just beginning the process of a DEI audit. How would you suggest we start?
Start by looking at your community. Let me get myself pulled back up here. I would refer you back to one slide. All right. I would refer you back to this slide that gives you sort of the path on this right here. Decide what it is you want to audit, if you want to do a whole collection or sample, and then do research on your community. Know who's there, know who's not there. Know who needs to be represented in your collection, even though they're not there. Investigate the tools. Some of them are free. Some of them cost money. Some of them are more complete than others. Work through that process, and then you'll able to fill the gaps from there. It sounds simple, but it is time consuming, and it is recognizing that none of the tools are complete and none of them are going to give you everything you need. So I would suggest starting small, working through it and see what maybe just one section of your library has and what it doesn't have, and work on that and go from there. A whole collection to look at once can be completely overwhelming. I would also be very glad to talk with you outside of this time and see how I could help or what other resources I could get for you.
There are a couple of videos on Reel's website on diversity audits, so I will post those in the chat. There
are also on this slide some as well, articles and videos that can help get you started on that, particularly that first one. Any other questions or comments? I would very much like to know if the start of this conversation today was helpful to you, if you learned anything with it, and what you need from there.
There is another question in the chat. Christine Edison asks, how would you recommend looking at nonfiction sections?
Nonfiction sections, I have the first thing with nonfiction sections is age of the collection. Nonfiction sections are necessarily not representative if they are too old. So age becomes a very important piece in looking at nonfiction. You need to be sure all of those ways that I talked about that people can be represented are represented in nonfiction as well as fiction. And you want to find those authors that do an excellent job of research and present a full picture for that nonfiction topic. That tends to be, I mean, there are authors of nonfiction in certain areas for children's and teen books that you absolutely can trust, and there are authors that are not so much. I would steer away from series books in nonfiction. Not all series necessarily, but series books are written by a formula. There's a particular way that they are put together, and they find people within their realm of authors to write those books, to do the research and write those books. They are not necessarily experts, nor have they done the extensive research that it should be. And I used to review some series books for one of the publications, and mistakes are rampant in some of them. So I would steer away from any but the best of series books, and there are some, and check the age. Those are the most important factors when looking at nonfiction. I'm going to ask one thing after I share the slideshow with Rachel to share with you. I'm going to ask that this slideshow is for your purposes. If you choose to share it with anyone else, please walk them through the slideshow yourself. You be the person that helps them understand. And the reasons I say that is this is a personal story for me, and I'm very, very happy to share it with those of you that are wanting to hear the story and all the pieces that go with it. But I'm not interested in those people that haven't heard me speak, just have use of the PowerPoint without your guidance. So I will ask that, please. Is there anything else? We have 2 minutes left. That's time for a question or a comment. I would be interested in knowing if you found this helpful. Rachel, is there anything you wanted to know or anything more that need to be mentioned?
No, thank you. It was a really great presentation.
Thank you to all of you for choosing to share your time with me today. And please reach out to me if there's any way I can help.